The words hung in the living room air, heavy and sharp as shards of glass. "You're autistic and have 48 hours to get your stuff. Your sister owns the house now." Wei Cohen Bauer, his father, delivered the sentence with the same cold detachment he'd used to discuss his construction company's balance sheets. Beside him, his mother, Layla Desmet, nodded, her face a mask of resolute determination, her gaze averted. And there, leaning against the doorframe with a nearly imperceptible smirk, was her, Catalina Bakker, the younger sister, the heir, the golden child. Arav Olsen, 24 years old, received the news not with the tears or rage they might have expected, but with a profound analytical silence. His mind, which operated in patterns and systems his family had always labeled quirky or broken, began to process the declaration not as an emotional assault, but as the logical conclusion of a long, painful equation. He'd never imagined that the eviction from his own home, the place where every floorboard creak and wall stain was a landmark on his mental map of the world, would be the catalyst for everything. But as he watched the three faces that should have represented safety and love, a chilling calm settled over him. They weren't just kicking him out, they were pulling the trigger on a weapon he'd secretly been assembling piece by piece his entire life. Arav didn't need time to understand. He already knew. There had been signs, tiny data points he'd been collecting and archiving in his memory. A quick flashback hit him. Himself, 10 years old, showing his father a simple computer program he'd created, only to be ignored as Wei effusively praised a mediocre horse drawing Catalina had made. Another, more recent, his mother, Layla, on the phone with a friend, sighing that the cost of caring for someone like Arav was a financial and social burden they hadn't foreseen. Her words, whispered but perfectly audible through his bedroom door, were catalogued. And the most painful of all, Catalina, his own sister, mocking his routines, calling his noise-canceling headphones ridiculous, and deliberately moving furniture to cause him sensory discomfort, laughing when he stumbled. These were acts of cruelty disguised as sibling banter, each a tiny betrayal, a confirmation that he was the outsider, the problem to be contained. The house, for him, had never been a home. It had been a carefully managed habitat to minimize friction with its neurotypical inhabitants. Now even that was being denied him. "The house has been in Catalina's name since last week," Wei continued, as if closing a business deal. "We considered it an advance on her inheritance. It's for the best for everyone. You need to learn to fend for yourself in the real world, son. We won't be here forever." The word son sounded hollow, a formality devoid of any affection. Their real world was a place he already inhabited, a digital realm of logic and code, where he was fluent and powerful, something they'd never bothered to understand. They saw his computer time as a recluse's pastime, not the construction of a fortress. "Understood," Arav finally said, his voice level, devoid of emotion. 48 hours. Their reaction was one of contained surprise. They had expected a scene, a breakdown. His calm disarmed them. It was as if they'd tried to topple a wall that, to their astonishment, offered no resistance. Arav turned and walked towards his room, the only place in that house that was truly his. Each step was deliberate. As he closed the door, he felt no despair. He felt clarity. The game had changed. The unstated rules of tolerance and conditional acceptance had been replaced by a declaration of open war. And in a war of information, logic, and patience, Arav knew with mathematical certainty he held the absolute advantage. He opened his closet and pulled out a series of storage boxes. But the first thing he grabbed weren't clothes or books. It was a stack of external hard drives, each meticulously labeled. Years of bank statements, copies of documents he'd found in his father's office, audio recordings of phone conversations made on speakerphone in the living room, and a detailed file of every broken promise and every cent siphoned from a fund his grandfather had supposedly left him. A fund his parents swore never existed. They considered him incapable of understanding the complexities of the world. They were about to discover how deeply they had underestimated his analytical capacity. While outside his family was discreetly celebrating their victory, Arav Olsen was initiating the first phase of his counterattack. They'd given him 48 hours to vacate his home. He would use that time to ensure that very soon they'd have nowhere to run. The calm they'd seen wasn't resignation. It was the serenity of one who had weathered far worse storms internally and survived to tell the tale. Here, faced with the greatest betrayal of his life, he stood firm like one guarding a secret too powerful to reveal before its appointed time. If this story of prejudice and resilience touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover how a simple moment of humiliation would turn into the catalyst for a family revolution no one would ever forget. The first call Arav made was to Owen Wright, a childhood friend who had always seemed to speak his language, understanding his silences as well as his words. Owen didn't ask unnecessary questions. Upon hearing the situation, his response was immediate. "My place is your place, for as long as you need." Within an hour, Owen's car was in the driveway, and together they began moving boxes. Arav worked with methodical efficiency, each movement calculated, his face a blank canvas. To his parents and sister, who watched from the kitchen window, he looked like a defeated automaton, merely following orders. Little did they know that every box he carried out of that house was one less brick in the foundation of their lives. The true depth of their cruelty revealed itself the next morning. With 24 hours still remaining before the deadline, Arav tried to use his debit card to buy more boxes and was declined. A quick check of his banking app showed the unthinkable. His balance was zero. Every cent, saved from years of freelance work as a data analyst and programmer, work his parents had dismissed as his computer hobby, had vanished. A transfer, made the previous night, to Wei and Layla's joint account. Minutes later, a text message from his mother flashed on his phone. "Consider this reimbursement for all the extra expenses we've had with you over the years. It's for your own good, so you learn the value of money." The euphemism was so vile it bordered on the absurd. They hadn't just kicked him out. They'd left him penniless, deliberately trying to incapacitate him. The injustice was so complete, so calculated, it transcended anger and solidified into icy purpose. Their arrogance was boundless. Catalina, wasting no time, began her social media campaign. A photo of her beaming on the front porch captioned, "New chapter, so grateful for my amazing parents who helped me get my dream house. Blessed.ger new home.homeowner." The post garnered likes and congratulatory comments from friends and family who had no idea of the grim truth behind the smiling image. Later, she posted an Instagram story showing Arav's former room, now bare, with paint cans on the floor. "Time for a total reno. Gotta get the weird energy out of this place," she wrote, adding a laughing emoji. It was a digital, public, humiliating jab. She wasn't just taking his space, she was trying to erase his existence. And then, a direct message arrived on Arav's phone. "Hey, just wanted to see if you're okay. Hope you're not living on the streets or anything. Mom and Dad just did what was best for the family. No hard feelings, right?" The audacity, the complete lack of empathy was staggering. To them, he wasn't a person. He was a problem that had been solved. But they had made a fundamental miscalculation. They believed that by removing his support structures, his home, his money, his routine, he would disintegrate. They didn't understand that Arav's mind thrived on logic and data, not material comfort. Catalina's taunts, his mother's cruel messages, his father's blatant theft, none of it broke him. Instead, it provided more data for his model. Each act of contempt was a new knot in the noose he was weaving for them. In Owen's apartment, surrounded by his boxes and the welcoming clutter of a true friend, Arav set up his new command center. His laptop, an older but powerful model, hummed to life. He wasn't looking for jobs or apartments. He was immersed in lines of code, encrypted spreadsheets, and audio files. He was building his weapon. Owen watched him, concerned. "Man, you sure you're all right? You've barely said anything since you got here." Arav paused his typing for a moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He turned to Owen, and for the first time, there was an expression on his face. It wasn't sadness or anger. It was a cold, focused intensity, a glint of pure, unsparing intelligence in his eyes. "They think the world is run by emotions and appearances, Owen," Arav said, his voice low and steady. "They're wrong. It's run by systems, by data, and they've given me unfettered access to all their systems for 24 years. Every new humiliation only strengthened something inside him that his oppressors couldn't see, a silent power fueled by the very injustice they sought to impose. What those privileged people didn't know was that each act of contempt was, in fact, writing their own death sentence. For a moment, when he bowed his head walking out of that house for the last time, everyone thought they had broken his spirit. But those who know true strength know it grows precisely in silence, in observation, and in the meticulous planning that precedes the storm. The first few days were dedicated to survival and funding. Arav knew he couldn't execute his plan without resources. Using a secure network and his exceptional cybersecurity skills, he began participating in bug bounty programs, where large corporations pay ethical hackers to find flaws in their systems. For most, it was arduous, time-consuming work. For Arav, it was like reading a book in his native tongue. Within a week, he had amassed more money than his parents had stolen from him. Every cent earned legitimately through his intellect. With his financial situation stabilized, he moved to phase 2, the legal arm. He didn't want just any lawyer. He needed a shark, someone who understood not just the law but the nature of systemic injustice. His research led him to one name, Eleni Phillips, a brilliant attorney, known for her relentless approach and for taking cases others deemed impossible, especially those involving discrimination and corporate fraud. Arav booked a consultation. He walked into Eleni's sleek office, a stark contrast to the chaos of his past few weeks. She assessed him with sharp eyes, expecting the tale of an emotional, betrayed young man. Instead, Arav opened his laptop and, with the precision of a surgeon, laid out his case. It wasn't a plea. It was an indictment. He showed Eleni the spreadsheets. One meticulously tracked every cent of the trust fund his maternal grandfather, a man who had always understood him, had left for him. The fund was supposed to have been handed over to him on his 21st birthday. His parents, Wei and Layla, as trustees, had systematically drained it over a decade, using the money to finance the family's lavish lifestyle and Catalina's whims. Every withdrawal was documented, with dates and amounts, cross-referenced with luxury purchases, vacations, and even the down payment on Catalina's sports car. Then, he played the audio files. His father Wei's voice on a call with his accountant discussing how to dissolve Arav's trust assets without raising red flags. His mother Layla's voice, reassuring Wei that Arav would never be able to understand this stuff anyway. Eleni Phillips listened, her expression shifting from professional skepticism to astonishment, and finally, to a cold, controlled rage. She had seen greed and cruelty before, but the combination of financial abuse with explicit prejudice against her own son's neurodiversity was particularly vile. "They didn't just steal from you," Eleni said, her eyes fixed on the screen. "They used your diagnosis as justification. They underestimated you on a fundamental level. That is the premise of my entire life," Arav replied, "and it will be the premise of their undoing." Eleni agreed to take the case, not just on a contingency percentage but with personal vigor. She saw in Arav not a helpless victim, but a brilliant strategist who had turned years of pain into an arsenal of irrefutable evidence. The first action was to send a formal yet menacing letter to Wei Bauer's lawyers. The letter mentioned discrepancies in the administration of a trust fund and requested a full accounting. Wei, upon receiving the news, scoffed. "The kid is desperate," he told Layla. "Hired some jailhouse lawyer to try and scare us. He's got nothing." They responded with a dismissive letter, denying the existence of any fund and insinuating Arav was mentally unstable. Meanwhile, their lives continued on their trajectory of arrogance. Wei was on the verge of closing a massive contract with the city for a new community complex, a project that would solidify his reputation as a pillar of the community. Catalina continued to post about her perfect life, oblivious to the storm brewing. But they didn't know that the letter about the trust fund was merely a distraction, the first bait. While they focused on that, Arav was working on something far bigger. He had spent years observing his father's business, not out of interest but because the patterns fascinated him. And he had noticed a pattern in the Bauer construction bids, a pattern that made no statistical sense. He sent the encrypted file to Eleni Phillips. The subject line of the email contained a single word, foundation. Eleni opened the file, and what she saw made her catch her breath. This wasn't just about family fund money. This was about bid-rigging fraud, about collusion with city officials, about a decade of public contracts won through corruption. Arav hadn't just documented the rot within the walls of his home. He had mapped the rot at the foundation of his father's empire. It was when everyone laughed at his apparent defeat that something unexpected began to take shape. For a moment, when he accepted the situation without protest, they thought they would witness just another predictable failure. But those who watched closely would have noticed it wasn't fear that moved him. It was the contained power of one poised to rewrite their own story, using the ink of truth their enemies had so generously provided. The execution of the plan was a masterpiece of timing and precision. Eleni Phillips filed not one, but 3 simultaneous lawsuits. The first was a civil action against Wei Bauer and Layla DeSmet for fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty, detailing the theft of Arav's trust fund in excruciating detail, with copies of bank statements and audio transcripts attached. The second was a formal complaint to the Civil Engineering Ethics Board, presenting evidence of bid rigging fraud. And the third, the most devastating, was a comprehensive dossier, anonymously delivered to a well-known investigative journalist at the city's leading TV station, Kaito Michel. The dossier contained Arav's data analysis, so clear and well presented that even a layman could understand Wei's corruption scheme. Wei's initial reaction was furious denial. He called his lawyer, shouting about his ungrateful son and the unscrupulous attorney, but his lawyer's tone was grim. Wei, this isn't an allegation. These are receipts. These are recordings. These are your own emails. What they have is an atomic bomb. Panic began to set in. Layla, who had always lived in a bubble of denial and privilege, crumbled, unable to process that her carefully constructed world was unraveling. But the real implosion began when Kaito Michel's report aired in prime time. The headline was devastating. City builder, philanthropist or fraud, executive accused of stealing from autistic son's trust and manipulating public contracts. The segment was relentless. It showed photos of Wei accepting civic awards, juxtaposed with the data proving his crimes. It showed Catalina's lavish social media posts, while narrating how the money for that lifestyle had been stolen. The public image of family man and pillar of the community was systematically demolished on national television. For Catalina, the impact was instant and brutal. Her phone exploded. The hundreds of comments on her photos turned from admiration to contempt. Thief. Shame. Give your brother his money back. Her friends stopped answering her calls. The doors to the social circles she so valued slammed shut in her face. Her identity, built on wealth and status, evaporated within hours. The city immediately announced the suspension of all contracts with Bauer. Construction, pending a federal investigation. Business partners distanced themselves. The company's accounts were frozen. In less than 24 hours, Wei Cohen Bauer's empire lay in ruins. Desperate, the 3 of them showed up at Owen's apartment. They pounded on the door, demanding to see Arav. When Owen finally opened it, they shoved past him and confronted Arav, who was sitting calmly in front of his laptop. "How could you do this to us? We are your family," Layla screamed, her face streaked with tears of self-pity. Wei tried a different approach, the negotiator. "Okay, kid, you win. You want the house? It's yours. Want the money back? I'll give you double. Just make this stop. Withdraw the charges." Catalina, pale and trembling, just whispered, "You've ruined my life." Arav finally looked at them. His eyes held no hatred, no triumph. There was only a desolate calm, the calm of a final conclusion. He stood up, his posture erect and dignified. "This was never about the house, or even about the money," he said, his voice clear and steady, cutting through their emotional chaos. "This was about the truth. You built your lives on a foundation of lies, deceit, and the belief that I was beneath you, incapable of understanding or reacting. You underestimated me." He paused, looking at each of them. "This is not a negotiation. It is a results presentation. You invested years of cruelty and prejudice. These are the returns on that investment. You were not destroyed by me. You were destroyed by your own actions, which I simply organized and presented to the world." He turned and walked towards his makeshift bedroom, closing the door softly behind him, leaving them alone with the wreckage of their lives. The sound of the door closing was more final than any shout. As revelations piled up and masks fell away, a new reality took shape. At the epicenter of the scandal, where discrimination and greed had once reigned, an unshakable truth emerged. The boy they tried to Erase was, in fact, the architect of their final judgment. Justice, like data, does not lie. In the months that followed, the fall of the Bauer de Smet family was complete and public. The civil lawsuit resulted in an overwhelming settlement in Arav's favor. He not only recovered the full amount of his grandfather's trust fund, but also received substantial compensation for emotional and financial damages. Way Bauer, to avoid a prison sentence for tax fraud and corruption, reached a plea deal with the prosecution, lost his contractor's license, and was forced to sell all company and personal assets to pay fines and restitution. The Grand House, the symbol of their status, was the first to go in a judicial auction. Arav didn't want it back. The place was tainted with memories he had no interest in revisiting. Way and Layla moved into a small rented apartment in the suburbs, their social lives annihilated, their former friends crossing the street to avoid them. Way, the former magnate, now worked as a project manager for a small firm, a shadow of the man who once commanded boardrooms. Layla, who had never worked a day in her life, had to take a job as a receptionist at a clinic. Humiliation was her daily companion. Catalina suffered the fate she feared most: irrelevance. Stripped of her wealth and status, she discovered she had nothing else to offer the world she so valued. She tried to reinvent herself, but the stain of scandal followed her. The last Arav heard of her, she was working as a sales associate in a department store, her former arrogance replaced by a bitter weariness. Arav, on the other hand, thrived. With the settlement capital and the money he'd earned, he and Owen Wright founded Olsen Analytics, a cybersecurity and data analysis firm. Arav's story, rather than being a hindrance, became his greatest advertisement. Corporations lined up to hire the man who, single-handedly, had unraveled a complex web of corruption using nothing but logic and data analysis. His neurodivergent mind, once seen by his family as a weakness, was now celebrated in the tech world as a superpower. He was sought after for speaking engagements, not just on data security, but on the power of neurodiversity in the workplace. He built an environment in his company where people with different kinds of minds could flourish. Eleni Phillips became a close friend and advisor, and together they established a foundation to provide legal support to neurodivergent individuals facing discrimination. A year after his eviction, Arav stood by the window of his office in a sleek downtown building, watching the lights flicker on. Owen entered the room with 2 cups of coffee. "Thinking about them?" Owen asked gently. Arav pondered for a moment. "Not about them," he replied. "I was thinking about patterns. They followed a destructive pattern of behavior and arrived at a logical outcome. I followed a constructive pattern and arrived at another." He turned from the window, a genuine, tranquil smile on his face. "They thought kicking me out of my home would leave me with nothing, but in truth they set me free. They removed me from a system that was limiting me and forced me to build my own." The lesson was clear and powerful. Justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about proving them wrong in their most fundamental premise. They believed he was less, and he proved he was more. The best revenge wasn't their ruin, but his own resounding success, built with the very tools they had scorned. They tried to destroy Arav, but they ended up destroying themselves. Arav learned that true revenge isn't about reciprocating the harm suffered. It's about achieving the success your enemies could never imagine. And you, what would you have done in Arav's place? Leave your opinion in the comments if you've ever faced a situation where you were completely underestimated. If stories of clever justice like this inspire you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and activate notifications, because sometimes, to rebalance the scales, karma needs a well-executed plan.